Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Pascal Chariot. I am the president of Enerdata, and I would like to welcome you for this webinar today, which is the second of a series of 4 webinars we are having to celebrate our 30 years anniversary, as Enerdata was incorporated 30 years ago as a spin-off of a research center. We took this opportunity to look back at what has been happening during these 30 years and to what could be, or not will be, could be happening in the next 30 years. So we have a series of 4 conferences. Today is the second one. The first one took place on last Tuesday, is available on our channel. And it was about the global economy evolution and energy transitions. And today we will look in more details at the energy systems, the supply side and the different energy systems evolution during the past and for the near future that could be happening. Next week, we'll have another session focusing on the demand trends, energy efficiency, energy sufficiency, north and south differences. And the last session we will have will take place in 2 weeks' time, and we'll ensure we look at other actors in the countries and typically look at how the corporates are involved in the energy transition, and also how much the citizens and the local authorities are changing their mindset and getting involved in these transitions. So thank you again for joining us. Today, the chair of this conference will be Silvana Mima. Silvana is a senior CNRS researcher at Grenoble Applied Economics Laboratory, GAEL, in the University of Grenoble-Alpes. Silvana has been one of the main contributors in the development of the POLS model, which will show some results today in our scenarios, and she participated in a series of European research programs during the last years in energy foresight, on security of supply, low carbon transition, etc. And Silvana also participated in different modeling sessions in the International Energy Workshop and the Integrated Assessment Modeling Community. So thank you, Silvana, for chairing this session. The floor is yours. You're on mute, maybe. Silvana, we can't hear you yet.
Yes.
Yep, go ahead.
Well, it is always nice to celebrate a wonderful success story like this of Enerdata. I can imagine how proud and happy must be Bruno Lapillon and Bertrand Chateau today, seeing the results of their efforts. So first of all, I would like to congratulate them for all this they have done. Of course, congratulations go also to all colleagues and friends of Enerdata that have contributed to the increasing good reputation of this dynamic enterprise, and also the new direction team. During the 30 years of Enerdata, as Pascal noticed, Enerdata has always contributed to answer most of thorny issues in the field of energy system, like improving energy efficiency. I remember seminars in the 90s with Eastern European countries on their energy transition to market economy, or since 2004, the EU project World Energy Outlook hydrogen. So it was always in the point of the new research issues. More recently, many projects have concerned the decarbonization process, the deployment of renewable sources of energy, and new dimensions in organization of the energy system. New concerns are under consideration, not only hydrogen, but how the competition among energy carriers is modifying according to their capacity to be decarbonized, how to introduce a greater flexibility, both in consumption and production, or the emergence of more decentralized energy systems. In the supply side, how fossil fuel industries may face the need to disinvest from fossil fuels and maintain investment capacities for deployment of the new technologies. So it is quite normal that today we debate on the energy systems in a decarbonization future that I am delighted to chair and announce 3 experimented and eminent speakers. First of all, and internal to Enerdata is Quentin Chini, which is a project manager in the Global Energy Forecast Department of the Enerdata. He will focus on major expected changes of the energy system and projections in contrasted scenarios of emission constraints by 2050. The second one, Cédric Philibert, is a distinguished research associate at IFRI and the former IEA expert. He will identify possible pathways to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, describing the expected change in the organization and functioning of energy system in new social technical parameters. The last but not the least is Manfred Hafner, which is an internal to Enerdata, but a well-known international energy expert, professor at Johns Hopkins Europe and Sciences Po Paris, and he will describe the different ways in which major oil and gas companies strategies intend to overcome the challenge of decarbonization and their potential consequences on international energy markets. So each of the speakers dispose 10 to 15 minutes each. The presentation will be followed by a roundtable of around 40 minutes. During the presentation, please put your questions in Q&A box in order to use them during the roundtable. So the screen now is to Quentin. Please, Quentin.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the introduction, Silvana, and thank you all for attending this second session of our conference cycle, my personal second session as well. So as mentioned today, I will be presenting from a bit of a more of a top perspective, aggregated approach, the major changes that are expected in the energy system by 2050. With a special emphasis on Enerfuture, which is Enerdata's internal exercise of producing long-term energy and emissions scenarios. So let's get into it. So first of all, to give you a bit of context with regards to the Enerfuture scenarios, let's look at their respective definitions and main assumptions and main outcomes, right? So the first one, we have 3 different scenarios which offer a good range of possible outcomes when it comes to the future of energy systems globally. The first one being Enerbase, which is our baseline scenario, right? It consists of basically only integrating the existing measures, right? So we end up with sort of an extrapolation of historic trends where energy consumption is mostly derived and driven by economic growth, population growth, with a little bit of energy efficiency or an improvement in energy intensity indicators, which is in line with what we've seen historically. Then we have the Enerblue scenario, which is an intermediate scenario, which basically accounts for additional realistic measures, right? With the goal of being aligned with the first NDCs and more specifically their emission targets that have been formulated in that context. And then we have the Energreen scenario. The Energreen scenario is a backcasted scenario where we basically define a combination and an allocation of the effort by country to reach a situation where we think the temperature increase will be limited to 2 degrees or below 2 degrees actually. So the scenarios are very differentiated in terms of assumptions, in terms of logic, and as you can see, in terms of results here, right? You have, well, the base case gives you a good indication of what would happen if we're not doing anything, basically, to mitigate energy consumptions and related GHG CO2 emissions. EnerBlue is definitely a step up, but EnerGreen shows that we would need to have a major shift to be able to align with what we intend to have, which is, you know, temperature increase being contained below 2 degrees Celsius. And you can see in the different indicators here that we have Enerbase being more or less in line with what's been observed historically here, with a -2% decrease of carbon intensity, -1.6% of energy intensity. So, you know, the GDP drives energy consumption and emissions upwards, but there's a bit of a mitigation here. EnerBlue is obviously an increase, as mentioned, but, you know, EnerGreen, the indicators are completely changed here. So with that in mind, let's dive in, you know, a bit more details about these particular scenarios, and looking at here the global primary energy mix, meaning the global primary supply by fuel or types of fuel, and looking at the differences both you know, between the scenarios and compared to historically, right? So nowadays we have around 80% of fossil fuels in our primary energy supply, which hasn't really changed in the last 30 years, and it's not going to drastically change according to the Enerbase scenario if we're not doing anything to change that, basically by 2050, where we basically at 75%, so a very low increase. EnerBlue would allow us to reduce to a small extent the dependency on fossil fuels, but it's only in EnerGreen that we see a drastic change with the share of fossil fuels dropping to 34%, with a very limited contribution of coal, which is a key element here. And well, you actually 34% is still significant, and this is why it's a below 2 degree scenario. You have much more ambitious approach that we need to tackle fossil fuels contributions in an even deeper fashion. So we end up with in a EnerGreen, for example, the contribution of renewable plus nuclear, so as you know, put together clean energy sources, reaching 66%. Now, I'm not going to go into too much technological detail. I think the following presentation, especially the one from Cedric and the following roundtable, will be able to address that. But looking at one of the key elements of an energy transition, of a deep decarbonization scenario here, is, you know, electrification. Electrification is a key in a deep decarbonization pathway, right? And if you look at the figures here, you see that there's a big difference. It's a big factor of differentiation between scenario, the share of electricity and final energy consumption here, for example. So we reach 40% of final energy consumption in the EnerGreen scenario, which is much higher than historically and much higher than the baseline. It could still be seen as quite a conservative figure. One thing to keep in mind is that electrification not only allows to have a decarbonized energy vector, but is also often, in most cases, actually associated with major efficiency gains. This is the case of electric vehicles, which are much more efficient than thermal vehicles, or heat pumps in all the basically the heating energy needs, right? So the share of equipment that is electrified is usually much higher, or higher at least, than the share in the energy consumption. And one example that we have here, for example, is the EV penetration, which reaches more than 80% in the EnerGreen scenario. So yeah, but they're much more efficient than thermal vehicles. So that's not necessarily directly reflected in the energy mix. It's interesting also to see that there is some, at least in our scenarios, a market-driven EV penetration. As you can see that the Enerbase scenario has a significant increase in the share of electric vehicles. Now, this electrification as a lever, as a driver to decarbonize energy systems is only, or at least it's all the more the case if we decarbonize electricity supply, right? Electricity generation. So that two things that should happen in parallel. And that's something that we reflect in our scenarios as well. When you look at the carbon content of electricity generation globally, we're targeting basically a 90% decrease in 2050 in the Energreen scenario, with very little remaining CO2 emission from electricity generation, which again needs to happen if we are to fully reap the rewards of electrification and energy consumptions. This chart on the right gives you an indication of how this effort, like going from the NA-based scenario where we have a slight increase in emissions, or well, actually not a quite significant increase in emission over time from the power sector, all the way down to the Energreen scenario here. And we can see how it's broken down between the different options, different technological options that we have, with a big contribution from wind and solar in particular, a little bit of nuclear. It's actually already a decent development of nuclear in the NA-based scenario, so the difference between scenarios is relatively small. One thing that's also interesting to look at is, well, we have a relatively low development of CCS, and that's something I will talk about afterwards as well. And production change, meaning here that we also reduce the demand for electricity in the two scenarios, which is also a contributor to reducing emissions. And it's interesting because on the one hand, we have, as we said, electrification, which drives electricity demand upwards. And on the other hand, we have a lot of energy efficiency efforts, which reduces electricity consumption. Ultimately, what we are showing here is that we think there's going to be a negative, or at least a positive, when it comes to abatement, contribution of electricity demand, which means that compared to the two scenarios, despite the higher share of electricity in final demand, there will be a lower electricity demand. So there will be the efficiency and sufficiency components will more than compensate for the increased electrification.
Thank you, Gunther.
I have one last slide, if you allow me, Silvana. No, it's fine. And it's actually a bit of a transition to Cédric's presentation, because I wanted just to give a few alternative scenarios, or at least one key work, which is obviously the World Energy Outlook from the International Energy Agency, to better understand that there are so many different approaches, even if we're looking at the same global objectives of reducing emissions. And what you can take from this chart is that basically we are more focused on reducing energy demand and efficiency with means of sufficiency and efficiency, as opposed to other works that are perhaps more technology focused. And actually the scenarios from the IEA are very informative in the role of alternative fuels and alternative technologies, where we rely a bit less on that. And if you look at the charts, you can see that our demand in Energreen is much lower than a comparable scenario, which is the sustainable development scenario here, and even lower than what we have in the net zero emission scenario, right? But on the other hand, if you look at the carbon intensity here on this chart, it is lower in the SDS scenario. So we have less demand, but a bit more intense, a bit more carbon emissions compared to comparable scenarios. And obviously, in net zero emission scenario, there's no longer any CO2 emission. So, yeah.
This difference is due to
just a different approach. We rely more on, when we develop our scenarios, we rely a bit more on introducing elements of energy efficiency as sufficiency, reducing activity levels, rather than maintaining, or at least more activity, but with a lot more technologies that allow to abate emissions.
Thanks. Please, Cédric, the screen is yours.
Yes, thank you. Well, great minds think alike. I see lots of common features in both scenarios, but as Quentin rightly pointed out, there are also some differences, and I think the way he described them was perfectly correct. I will now share my screen to go to my presentation, right? Possible pathways to get net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, and indeed it heavily draws on the IEA net zero by 2050 publication that has been then taken up by the World Energy Outlook. Just a few slides. On this report, so this is the global electricity mix and how it's supposed to change. And what you see here is the wind power. This is solar power. So you see a big increase starting 2025. Hydro continues to grow with large plants in the developing emerging economies. Other renewables, nuclear will increase in terawatt hours. We'll see what its share will be. Then you have gas peaking by 2035 or so. You have coal, you have oil almost disappearing. Sorry, this is gas. What you had was based on hydrogen. And this is coal without CCS. So it should peak quite soon and start. So what you see here is basically that it's a growth mostly in solar and wind that will make the bulk of electricity. And you see the shares here. You have basically 1/3 of solar, 1/3 of wind power. And as both are variable, you understand that, of course, the role of flexibility in those power systems, the management of this variability become the key issue. Still, there is hydropower, which will be at about 12%. Nuclear share will not increase, it will slightly decrease. Basically, it doubles in terawatt hours, but the global electricity consumption also doubles. And then you have a few fossil fuels with or without CCS, very, very minor. Almost completely decarbonized. Basically, renewables do 90% in total, and of which solar and wind are the prominent forms. And at the same time, we see the share of electricity in final energy demand jumping from about 20% nowadays to 50%. And my personal view is that this is kind of a minimum. It can even be higher at the time. Indeed, as Quentin said, this brings about lots of energy efficiency improvement. If you we look at the total energy supply and see that now solar and wind through electricity, but also biomass in many forms, but mostly as solid biomass, are the three pillars of a low carbon energy world. So now we move from electricity to broad energy. This is total energy supply, what was formerly called final energy demand. And here you see how, I'll go directly to the top, by the way. So because you have an important lesson here, which is that the total energy supply reduces after 2025. And it reaches a peak and never comes back to that peak, despite an increase in population by 2 billion inhabitants and a doubling of GDP, for what GDP is worth, let's say a doubling of economic activity. So we have also here a significant improvement in energy efficiency, basically, because, well, you double the economic activity while you just maintain or even slightly reduce the final energy consumption. It's brought in by both energy efficiency improvements and electrification, which in itself brings about very important energy efficiency improvements. So now let's look more in detail. The shares, you still have some coal and oil mostly as a feedstock. You have gas, you have nuclear, and then you have the three forms of biomass, which represent basically an important share. And then you have solar and wind through electricity. So it's interesting to see that you still have this. Lots of it is with CCS, some is not, but it's net zero, it's not gross zero. So some some emissions are still acceptable in this scenario. And let's move to the role of hydrogen, because it's of course one very topical subject nowadays. Some lobbyists see hydrogen everywhere. Analysts see hydrogen in a few targeted uses where it helps. And the first are the current users of hydrogen, where we need low carbon hydrogen because we need to decarbonize hydrogen as we decarbonize everything else. And that's basically green ammonia and methanol for their current industrial uses. Methanol in chemicals and ammonia as mostly a precursor of nitrogen fertilizers. And then hydrogen is also used for refineries to upgrade and clean fuels. This use will reduce as the use of oil-based fuels will shrink. A big role to come is direct iron reduction in steel making with hydrogen. It's the direct iron reduction already exists. It's made with syngas extracted from natural gas, but here we could replace syngas with pure hydrogen, and we know it works. It has already been done, and some projects are being developed nowadays. Hybrid in Sweden, but you may have heard that ArcelorMittal is going to develop very large electrolyzers in Dunkirk to replace its blast furnaces. In the longer term, electrowinning could be even more efficient and preferable, but it's much less mature. So there is a significant role for hydrogen for a while. Then we'll use probably ammonia as fuel for the ships because it can be used in the existing diesel engines, and it's much easier to handle, to store, and to ship, to transport than pure hydrogen, dehydrogen, whether as a gas or as a liquid. We'll see methanol and synthetic hydrocarbon being used as electrofuels or as feedstock for the chemical industry. Hydrocarbons for aviation fuel, because we need the density of and the gravimetric energy density or specific energy of hydrocarbons for aviation, because the weight is a major issue. It would be sustainable only if the carbon is taken from the air, and the best source probably is, as we made biofuels, there is always a surplus of carbon, because the ratio of carbon over hydrogen in biomass is high, and therefore we have CO2 emissions from an ethanol plant is a big source of CO2, concentrated CO2 flux. So the idea is to add hydrogen to these productions and therefore deliver simultaneously biofuels and electrofuels with low carbon electricity, producing hydrogen that is injected into the process and the conversion of the biomass feedstock. So we use all the carbon of the biomass to make really sustainable fuels, because the carbon is of biogenic origin and the hydrogen will come from green electricity. We'll also use in the longer term hydrogen or maybe ammonia in power systems. In fact, it will start soon in Japan, who is going to import green or blue ammonia from abroad to put in its coal plants in co-combustion to reduce its CO2 emissions. But in the long term, we'll need that basically to complement solar and wind during the Dunkelflaute, the dark doldrums, the weeks with very low wind and low sunshine, while there is a high demand in winter. And we'll need to have to keep or even to build some more combined cycle gas turbines for this backup. But this is small quantities, and we'll be able to collect in the long term, we'll be able to collect that from surplus green electricity in our power system, turn it into hydrogen, store that hydrogen. And if we're not, then we will import it probably as ammonia from countries with better sunshine or wind conditions. And that's basically it. We may see some long-range trucking and industrial heat uses of hydrogen, but I think they will be small because electricity can do a lot for both long-range ground transportation, and it's improving by the day, and also for industrial heat with heat storage coming, and a lot of very great variability of technologies to electrify industrial processes. So I don't believe there will be a significant role for hydrogen in that, which also has its own problem. Finally, the respective role of efficiency and renewables. Indeed, as Quentin said, this scenario is perhaps more supply-oriented or technologically oriented than the one from Enerdata. However, it has still a role for of course, for efficiency improvement, but even for sufficiency. For the first time in the IEA, sufficiency has popped up as a dimension, whether it's purely a voluntary basis or incentivized by some policy changes. So you have behavioral changes and material efficiency also, because recycling is a source of energy efficiency. And then those technologies, you have a distinction here. Low carbon technologies that will be implemented in industries, like the example of steel making have been given. But then you also have a lot of low carbon technologies that suppose an active involvement of consumers, choosing to buy an electric car and not a thermal powered car is a choice that is still open to people and depends on people to be made. So yes, there is an active involvement of consumers. Maybe the behavioral changes can do more than is indicated here. Maybe we'll see some of it accelerated by events external to the climate change discussion, such as a war between Russia and Ukraine, just to give an example that may provide a willingness to reduce the dependency on Russian gas, or a willingness to reduce the sales of Russian oil as an economic sanction. So this could be accelerators of that behavioral part of the changes, but it's already here, and it can possibly grow, and we may get closer. Well, the IEA may come closer to Enerdata views in the future. Who knows? Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Cedric, and thank you also for the transition for the speak of Manfred. So Manfred, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you so much to you, Silvana, and thank you to Enerdata for having invited me to this 30-year Enerdata celebration conference. I have been asked to give my 2 cents on the topic on how the oil and gas companies are adapting to the decarbonization challenge. I'm going to present you my thoughts broken down in 4 parts. First, I will present a context. I will then speak about what the IOCs, the international oil companies, are doing. I will say a few words what the national oil companies are doing, the ones which belong to the countries which are the reserve holders in the world. And finally, I will come to some conclusions to sum up the presentation. So as far as the context and introduction is concerned, we should be aware that we are having, and we used to have, we had over the last few years, very few years, a dramatic acceleration on the policies, driven also by better scientific understanding on this climate phenomenon, and what we need to do to stabilize the climate. Let me just give you a few examples. A few years ago, not so long ago, we were told by the IPCC, the International Panel of Climate Change, that in order to stabilize the climate, it would be enough to stabilize, to limit the increase of the global temperature increase at around 2 degrees centigrade. Then later, we were told, no, actually, we will need to go well below 2 degrees. And this was at the time, more or less, of the Paris Agreement. And now, at least since the IPCC report was published in October 2018, we are told, no, we got it wrong. We need to really limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees centigrade. Otherwise, the climate gets out of control. So the scientists tell us that the situation is much worse than what they thought, and therefore we thought. And secondly, there is a dramatic acceleration in the reaction of policymakers to this new fact. It's very, very recent. What is the difference? I think this is important. What is the difference between 2 degrees centigrade and 1.5 degrees centigrade? The difference is that if you want to limit the temperature increase to 2 degrees centigrade, it means you need to reach a carbon neutrality by the end of the century, 1100. In order to get to 1.5 degrees centigrade, you need to have a carbon neutrality by mid-century, around 2050, and then carbon negative. Obviously, this is not easy. It's a huge challenge. But we are seeing a huge acceleration in a policy response to scientific evidence. And this policy response needs to come from policymakers, obviously, from governments, but it also needs to come from the corporate world, the one I'm going to speak later on, but it obviously also needs to come from society as a whole. So it's to decarbonize the world. Never forget, a world where today we are after 30 years of climate negotiations. The emissions have always gone up with some very little intervals where this very, very briefly went down. They went up. 2021 was again a record as far as emissions is concerned. And still, after 30 years of climate discussions, we have 80% of our primary energy supply, which is based on fossil fuel, coal, oil, and gas. We need to change. And the positive note from what I see is that over the very few last years, there has really been a dramatic acceleration in policy and policy implementation worldwide to really decarbonize by mid-century. European Union was the first one. Briefly after the 2018 report of the IPCC. Then we had China. Xi Jinping in September of 2020 announced in the United Nations in New York that he wanted to bring his country to net zero by 2060. Followed the US. When President Biden came to power, beginning of last year, announced carbon neutrality by mid-century. What I mean to say, even in Europe, 5 years ago, nobody would have talked about carbon neutrality by 2050. Today, not only Europe, including China. Who would have thought that China is coal, as you know, and coal is China. Who would have thought a few years ago that China would announce, and don't underestimate China. Normally, we may have targets. China normally has lower targets, but they overachieve most of the time, very often. We tend to underachieve our targets. So don't underestimate China. And the US are also on board. The three major geopolitical blocs are declaring today and are putting in place policies. We will see if we are successful or not. But at least this is a first in history that in 30 years, we went to come down from 80% to net zero. Huge challenge. And it's not only the three major consuming blocs China, the US, and Europe. It's also plenty of other countries, including those for whom you would have never thought that they would be on board, like the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and like Russia, which last year declared that they want to have a carbon neutrality by 2060 or somewhere by mid-century. So what I mean to say is that we are in a very bad situation compared to this climate, but we have some very positive signals. And of course, as I already mentioned, it's not enough that governments do their job. They are doing their job. We all need to do our job. Society as a whole needs, individually, we need to do our job. And the corporate world needs to do their job. And this is now the second part of my presentation. Now, what do the oil and gas companies do? Now, in order to address the oil and gas companies, the international oil and gas companies, I would differentiate between the European oil and gas companies and the American oil and gas companies. The major oil companies are mainly American and Europeans. Now, let me start with the European oil companies. The European oil companies, the Shell, BP, TotalEnergies, Eni, and so on, they have dramatically changed. They no longer see themselves as oil companies. They see themselves, all of them, as energy companies. They want to provide energy. We will always need energy. We may not need so much oil. So they see themselves as suppliers of energy. First point. Some of them even change their name in order, from a communication point of view, to reflect this element. It's the case, for instance, of Statoil, which became Equinor. It's the issue of Total, which became TotalEnergies with an S at the end, which means plural, many energies, and so on. But also the Shell, BP, Eni, they all see themselves nowadays as energy companies. Now, what does this mean in concrete terms? In concrete terms, this means that they are not going to give up immediately their traditional business, oil and gas. What it means, it's they are going to complement their traditional business with a new business. And the new business is renewables, mainly solar, wind, and biofuels or biomass. And it means going into electricity. Now, everybody with a different approach. Why are they not? Why are they still keeping oil and gas? Because that's a cash cow. In order to build up the future cash cow, in order to build up the new business. And of course, a CCUS, carbon capture, use and storage, and hydrogen, they all play a part of that. Electricity, let's take Shell, for instance. Shell has announced 2 years ago that they aim to become the largest electricity company in the world. While TotalEnergies, for instance, or some others, they want to become electricity companies by selling the electricity they produce themselves. Shell, for instance, they may do so, but they don't care who is producing it. They want to become closer. You know, the decarbonization, as Quentin and Cédric told us, also goes hand in hand with an electrification of final energy. So they want to be part of this electrification part, which is selling electricity, and they don't care if they produce it themselves or if they buy it on the market. They will be part of selling electricity, electricity. Nobody is going into coal for obvious reasons, but nobody is neither going into nuclear, which in theory, you could imagine is positive for the climate, because for the simple reason, it's too risky, too expensive, and also in most countries, in many countries, it is has a bad public perception viewpoint. Having said, just a little note, having said so, there are nuances among countries, and the Eni, for instance, the Italian oil and gas company, which used to have a subsidiary which was called the Eni Nucleare, which was responsible for the fuel cycle of nuclear. So processing of nuclear, they have shut it down many years ago when Italy decided to exit nuclear the second time. But they are financing, and they are very bullish on a startup in Boston, which is a spin-off of the MIT, on the development of small-scale fusion reactors. So you may think whatever you want, but I'm just explaining you that these companies, they have the money, and the money they are putting it they're investing it into technologies which they think will contribute to the decarbonization effort tomorrow. Now let me come to I will come back a little bit to pluses and minuses of these strategies, but let me tell you something about the American major oil companies, which have a partly quite different approach. The American oil companies, they very openly say they are not interested to go into renewables, and they are not interested into going into electricity. They understand the world is changing, and that they want to accompany the changing world, but they think renewables has a low rate of returns, and in any case much lower than what they are used in their traditional business, and in addition, very often still they are based on state subsidies, and they don't want to go into businesses based on state subsidies because when the state subsidies are gone, they are out there in the rain. So what their strategy is to go downstream into businesses which are promoting the decarbonization, but is much closer to their traditional business, which is biofuels, which is hydrogen, which is synthetic fuels, which we will need in the future, which is part of the fuel mix, which we will in any case need, and upstream in carbon capture, use, and storage. I'm not saying that the European companies do not also have a similar approach on this latter part, but the European companies, at least in their communication, they are focusing mainly on renewables and electricity, but they are also developing and research and development and developing biofuels, synthetic fuels, hydrogen, and so on. Now, what about national oil companies? Now, the national oil companies have been the latest to react to this global decarbonization momentum. The first one were the Europeans, also mainly due to pressure by civil society, their own governments, and some stakeholders. Have followed much more recently the American ones, also because civil society, but also stakeholders, financial industry was pressuring companies. Maybe if I may make a parenthesis. In Europe, decarbonization and security of supply, the word has been mentioned today a few times, decarbonization and security of supply go hand in hand. You want to solve the security of supply problem in Europe? It's good to decarbonize. It's good to go into renewables. In the US, decarbonization is one story, security of supply is another story. The US, thanks to the shale oil and shale gas revolution they have had over the last 10 years, the US have become major exporters of gas, and they may become exporters of oil. So decarbonizing and security of supply are two different things, which makes it more complicated in the US compared to Europe. The latest to join this momentum are, of course, the developing countries, and in particular the countries which hold and which sell fossil fuels. And I would give the example of Saudi Aramco, the state-owned company of Saudi Arabia. Saudi Aramco, you know, Saudi Arabia has declared last year, a few months ago, that the country wants to get carbon neutral by 2016. The company is not going to declare policies 5 years ahead. It's only after Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, the one who runs de facto the country, has announced the decarbonization pathway to net zero, that the Saudi Aramco has reacted as well. Saudi Aramco, in any case, needs to participate in the vision, the Saudi vision, which is to make the Saudi kingdom less dependent on the sales on oil and gas worldwide, which means diversifying the economy of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. So what is Saudi Aramco as an example? Promoting. They are not yet doing, but they are the strategy, developing the strategy and promoting. Is of course upstream carbon capture, use and storage, downstream hydrogen and ammonia, because they have, and it would be mainly to start with blue hydrogen, but eventually later on also green hydrogen, because Saudi Arabia has a lot of solar potential. Another point which is quite interesting, which Saudi Aramco is looking at, is not necessarily selling hydrogen to the world, maybe, but as we know, transportation of hydrogen is very expensive. And so it makes sense for them not to sell the hydrogen itself, which when it arrives, wherever it needs to arrive, it becomes expensive, but to produce final products, which decarbonize steel, for instance, decarbonize steel to produce it there, and then to ship the steel, the decarbonized steel, thanks to the hydrogen they have produced cheaply overseas, and transporting steel doesn't cost very much.
Sorry,
now,
Manfred, you should conclude and we continue after in the roundtable.
I'm happy to conclude because now I'm coming to my conclusion. What I still wanted to mention in the conclusion part is that the European oil and gas companies, they are promoting a dual path right now. They are using the oil and gas business, which is a good business, and with the oil prices we see today, it's a wonderful business for them, to finance their future business in renewables and electricity. Secondly, many European companies, they also have targets on carbon neutrality, 2030, 40, 50. And this, how they are going to develop this, well, on the one hand side with the CCUS, on the other side with afforestation. There is no other way in doing that if you continue to produce oil and gas. Now, in a nutshell, what I wanted to say, oil and gas companies, the major oil and gas companies, are among the largest companies with huge financial needs, with huge financial means in the world, and they obviously want to remain in the business. They want to remain in the business of a decarbonized world. And they are therefore now, they have changed and they are changing and they are implementing the changes of accompanying the decarbonization pathway with new business models. They are different country by country, but you should not make the mistake of writing them off, because they have a big atout, as we say in French, to assets compared to many other companies to be part of the game.
Thank you very much, Manfred, for this very interesting presentation. Thank you all. So we can start now the round table. Please put your questions in Q&R to help us to organize this round table. However, a lot of questions are already, and one is part of the continuation of your speech, Manfred. You know that announced the targets of all these oil and gas companies concerning the decarbonization. Do you think that they are sincere engagements, or they are only hype or to an issue to increase their visibility and green financing?
I'm personally convinced that they are sincere, because you should not think that they are stupid. They know their business, they know the energy business, and if a few years ago they may have tried to do some greenwashing, whatever, but today they are aware. This was the reason why the first part of my presentation, I think, was so important. The tide is changing. The worldwide, the world is putting in place policies to decarbonize dramatically. Either they change and they adapt, or they are going to be out of business. And from their point of view, there is no way they can imagine to be out of business in 20, 30 years. They need to be sincere. They need to do something.
So let's hope that they will do this.
They do, because they need to do, because otherwise they will be gone. Kodak, remember Kodak?
We have seen that the prices of oil and gas had increased before the war, because I think it was a gap between green investment intentions and capacity of substituting without green fuel. So should the governments be aware to ensure a balance in the speed between both two tendencies? So should we promote more deeply the green financing, but how to complete to balance in the same time with the speed of using more green fuels? Do you think that it is a problem in this?
To me?
Yes, please.
I'm not sure I have understood your question, but
Can I repeat then? So
sorry?
See, the green finance is trying to promote more and more direction of investment.
The green finance is very important indeed. Green finance is very important indeed. If the question is, because the question can be raised, oil and gas companies, they will no longer find the money to do the traditional business. If this is the question, my answer is, well, I don't know, but so far we don't see that. So far, when I speak with CEOs of oil and gas companies or people close to it, what they tell me, and they want to go into renewables, and they have problems to get the money for the renewables, not for the oil. And they ask me, I don't understand. All this talk, we read it in the newspapers all the time about the green financing, that the financial institutions are no longer giving money for oil and gas and whatever. They tell me it's not at all what they see, and I tend to believe what they tell me, because when they make their roadshow to their investors to explain them what they do, they explain them what they do on oil and gas, they explain them what they do on renewables. The only thing which the investors are interested, apparently, is the bottom line, which is what they are paid for, by the way. So, so we do have a problem here, that it doesn't translate. It translates in communication, but not yet totally in action. Related to the question on pricing, which you mentioned, or the issue on pricing, which you mentioned, you say the prices increased quite strongly, in particular on gas, but also on oil, before the present war. As a matter of fact, as you remember, when the IEA presented its net zero scenario, they said, from now on, no more investments in new oil and gas development. It was the period of COVID, and the companies they had eliminated most of their in future investment in oil and gas because COVID demand was down, prices were extremely low. It was not profitable. Now the situation is different. But what is interesting is the longer term approach question. The world, for sure, we need to decarbonize. If the oil and gas prices, even before the war, have started to skyrocket, it was also due to the fact that there was an imbalance between supply and demand. We need to bring down over 30 years most of fossil fuel production and use, and we need to build up at the same time alternative uses. Nobody wants to be out in the dark. But giving the oil and gas producers the signal that if they stopped producing any additional oil and gas, we would for sure reduce demand of oil because supply of oil will be lower quicker. But we will for sure have a lot of oil shocks. Oil prices, which are very high. You need to look at this way. We need to go down, bring down at the same time demand and supply of hydrocarbons. If we bring down supply quicker than demand for some reason, we will have the prices which skyrocket. Or if we bring down demand quicker than supply, the prices will be in the basement. So the difficulty, there are many difficulties, but one of the difficulties of this transition is to bring them down in a coherent and parallel way, in order not to have price spikes as we saw, which from a purely decarbonization point of view is not that bad, because it's difficult to implement very high CO2 prices. But so the market does it perfect. The problem, of course, is where is this money going? And the problem is it's fluctuating.
From an audience, we have a comment here. The transition is not only about financing. It requires a massive change in the skills needed. Did you assess the job impacts, not only in terms in number of jobs, but in terms of types of jobs, and what it means in terms of changes in education programs and vocational training? And to know if the oil companies are serious about what they say, to what extent would they have already started vocational training for their staff to change of type of work? Manfred, it's for
to
you.
me.
Yes.
So, as I said earlier on, we have developed our economies based on hydrocarbons. It has always gone up, and so have the emissions. And now we need to go down in 30 years to practically zero, to net zero. So we need to change everything, including, of course, we need a lot of new jobs. We have a lot of new adapted jobs and so on. Are we quick enough in doing that? I don't know. But there are plenty of educational programs out there to offer skills for the new job. But I mean, there will be bottlenecks all along the value chain. There will be bottlenecks on rare material availability. There will be bottlenecks on plenty of different things, including for skilled workers. What are the oil and gas companies doing? Well, not enough for sure. They are using the people, most of the time, the people they have to go into the new business, which is maybe not the best people to do the new business. But this is what they have. They retrain them, yes. Could they do more? Yes, of course they could do more. Yeah, there is not much more I could say on this.
Okay, thanks. There are some questions concerning the participation of different technologies in the reduction of the emissions. So, for example, one question is CCS, carbon capture and sequestration, seems to play a very low role to obtain Energreen. Isn't it a counterintuitive given that BECCS, biomass capture and sequestration, are the only possibility to have negative emissions? And what about the DACS and CCUS?
I could say a few words.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the problem with CCS is that it always adds a cost to the use of fossil fuels, while now we have more competitive solutions with renewables and energy efficiency. So it has a role to play, but this role has come down over the years. I think initially there was a big mistake from the literature reviewed by the IPCC, where they saw most CCS being made in the power sector. And even that was 15 years ago or 20 years ago. And even then I start thinking, well, it makes no sense. If we have to have CCS, that will be in industry, because industrial plants tend to run 24/7, while in the power sector, with the rise of solar and wind power, we'll see the thermal power plants having less and less capacity factor de facto, because they are only needed when you have a Dunkelflaute or a few hours a day. And therefore, it's much more difficult to make cost-effective CCS in those conditions. And if there is to be some CCS, mostly will take place in industry, or to make blue hydrogen, for example. And CCS has almost disappeared from the perspective of the power sector, while it was prominent there. But still, there will be some CCS in industry, and maybe in cement making, for example, where it's you can change the chemistry, you can use more waste, but you still have the process emissions from the calcination of limestone that you cannot completely avoid, and therefore you could have CCS there, for example. Well, basically that's it. And I always object to the IEA for the use of CCUS, because use and storage are two completely different stories. With reuse, you can cut emissions in two, if I may say, reduce emissions by 50%. With storage, you can indeed have cancel emission, or even have negative emissions when you do BECCS, bioenergy CCS. There might be there is a discussion in particular with respect, I think, to aviation, because aviation fuels need to be hydrocarbons. We're not going to see in our lifetimes pure hydrogen aircrafts. Well, maybe Quentin will, but not us. And that means it's not going to help achieve any strong target by 2050. So what is possible is sustainable aviation fuel, but biomass will never suffice. Today it's 0.01%, so we have to multiply by 10,000. This is not going to happen. So then we have electrofuels. We'll take carbon from the biomass, likely. DACS is even more expensive. Direct air capture would requires. There are plenty of literature outside, very contradictory, etc. But I still assume that you have to. The trouble is that the concentration of CO2 in the air is way too low for DACS to work. I know we're working to increase it, but it's in parts per million, so it requires huge volume of air being treated. It's very, very difficult. So bioenergy CCS is indeed an option. And in a way, it could even be better than making sustainable fuels, because in both cases, you need to capture the CO2 from the biofuel manufacturing. Okay, Then storing it is relatively cheap. But then you have some risks, etc. On the other hand, adding this carbon to hydrogen, you have to produce the hydrogen, and we already need huge volumes of green electricity to decarbonize everything else. So you take part of this green electricity to make green hydrogen, then you do Fischer-Tropsch process to make fuel with the carbon you've captured. High costs. I don't care about the cost of flying. I mean, people have to cover the costs, that's it. And if this reduces the flight, so what? We've been living for millennia without flying, and then if that's a cost to survive, we'll stop flying or we'll fly less, and that's it. So I don't care about that cost, but I'm saying that if the official ORCE policy, CI policy is compensation. If you compensate the emission of using oil-based kerosene in aircrafts with real negative emissions from bioenergy CCS, you get about the same results, possibly, and at a significantly lower cost. So it makes sense, unless you demonstrate, which is a possibility, that with oil-based kerosene, you have much more contrail-induced cloudiness that is in itself another non-CO2 climate effect of aviation in the upper atmosphere, which you could reduce with synthetic kerosene, which has less NOx and less particulates emissions than oil-based kerosene. That would be a reason to prefer indeed the sustainable fuels to the compensation with BECCS. But the jury is still out on these options, I think.
Thank you. There is a question from Alain Robic. The first speaker said that electric vehicles were obviously more efficient than current fossil fuel burning cars. Is that really so obvious? Is this view not based? Does he take into account the huge progresses in the thermal engines? Conta, please.
Yeah, so I guess it's for me because it's as a response to something I said. So perhaps I shouldn't have used the word obviously, but I mean, basically what I'm describing is a scenario where, like in the EnerGreen scenario in particular, where you have basically EV penetration and EV completely overwhelming the market, right? So you're in a situation where thermal cars, because of all the drivers and the policies that we've implemented in the way we define the scenario, thermal cars are becoming obsolete. So there's no investment enough to sort of bridge the gap between thermal cars and electric vehicles. So it's not just I guess it's not a fact that is set in stone, but it's consistent with the scenario that we're developing. There's a lot more investment in electric vehicles in that context, and there's already a gap in terms of efficiency, which is only reinforced in that particular context of this scenario.
Quentin, I think the very best thermal engines approach 50% efficiency. That's the large diesel of maritime ships. For cars, it's 40% at best at constant speed, etc. In fact, it's moving between 20 and 40%. So on average, you can count on 25 to 30% at best. While electric motors and the battery and the charge, all the losses, you still have an efficiency of 75% from electricity. So yes, you have a lot of, you basically get 3 times more kilometers for the energy you put in both cars.
I mean, I completely agree. And my point was to say that this can only be reinforced in the scenario that we're considering.
Okay, thank you. Another question concerns Conta. What improvements of the Paul model are necessary to have a good characterization of the net zero emissions? Because for the moment, we have the same macroeconomic assumptions in both baseline and net zero emissions. which is not anymore coherent with the new world in the net zero emissions scenario. And another big issue may be the way we calculate oil prices, because the drivers has changed and will change more in the future. So what we need to do in this direction?
I mean, I'm going to give an answer that is a bit similar to something I said in the last session. I think there's already a lot of models. There's already an extensive coverage in terms of models and what they're covering when it comes to, you know, economic activity on the one hand, and also when you look at the energy system, there's a lot of different models with different scope. And I think so. We are able already to cover these sorts of aspects, but there's maybe a lack. And I'm not saying there's nothing done in that regard, but there's maybe a lack in combining these different approaches. And I think one key example in the power sector would be, if we look at what we have at Enerdata, which is mostly the POSE model, which is a huge integrated assessment model with a very large scope, both in terms of, you know, geographically and the type of sectors that are covered. But to the detriment sometimes of you know, some details about the actual technologies involved and how they interact and that sort of things. And on the other hand, you have models that are very detailed in the way they look at certain technologies. If you take a power system model with a limited geographic scope that is able to cover, you know, hourly or with a hourly or infra-hourly resolution and a very, very high spatial granularity. But these models are obviously missing the bigger picture. So I think the key to answering some of these crucial points is by combining these approaches, because typically when you look at flexibility, for example, so in our approaches, we sort of have to assume that we'll have the necessary flexibility. And this might actually be an issue, but that we're not necessarily able to cover. So this is why we need to have you know, more coupling and linkages between different approaches. Yeah, and on your question about oil supply and oil prices, it's basically the same answer I would give, because these models typically, although they are able to cover the bigger picture and even, you know, exchanges of oil extraction and oil exchanges globally, they're not really well designed to integrate shocks, basically, and that may be a problem that, you know, we're not really able to identify. So again, I would say that the answer would be to, you know, to be able to better combine different approaches to be able to give a more comprehensive and robust answer to these problems.
Okay, thanks. There is another question from Muzaffer Basaran from Turkey. France is promoting nuclear and Germany is against nuclear. What will be final standing of EU concerning nuclear?
Well, you know, energy policy is a prerogative of member states, first of all. So countries have their own mix as they wish. And then from a collective manner, we've seen that nuclear with some limits has been incorporated in the taxonomy, which allows to qualify as, I don't know if it's green or it's some kind of intermediate and transitory qualification for nuclear, allows to get some financing recognized as green in the portfolio of the financiers. But maybe that's a necessary conditions for getting private finance, but that's certainly not a sufficient condition for getting private finance in nuclear. So I'm not sure it will change a lot things because at the end of the day, it's only governments that finance nuclear expansion. If you consider the financing of the Hinkley Points two European pressurized reactors, it's the locals plus China. If you look at EDF, we'll know it will be with a strong governmental support. And by the way, the rationale for making nuclear, which has been put forward by the RTE in its study on the energy futures, showing that despite the lower cost of renewables, systems with 100% renewables could end up being more expensive than systems that have a significant share, like 30% of nuclear, 30 to 50% of nuclear power electricity in the mix, because of the cost of the flexibilities and the grid extension due to the variability of solar and wind. This demonstration rests on the assumption that all technologies are financed with the same interest rate, which requires basically that all nuclear financing is public, which in the current situation means public debt. And that's interesting because when you listen to the candidates to the election, you see that the same that are the most worried about increasing the public debt are also the most supportive of nuclear power. And therefore, there might have an issue here because it has to be debt. And while the renewables are mostly financed, almost exclusively financed on private equity and loans from banks. So indeed, you have a framework that gives a certainty on the sales, etc. But that's not private public money. That's all private money that is, and the weighted average compound WACC is lower than the 4% that have been chosen by RTE in its financing. So if you can have the power production of electricity finance on the private, why would you add public financing with a debt? Should you not, whatever the level of debt you assume being acceptable and sustainable, should you not keep it for research and development, universities, hospitals, or even some energy efficiency improvements that are hard to finance from the private, like thermal insulation of the worst houses, etc., etc. So I'm not sure it's going very far with respect to new nuclear, and I'm not sure the decision made at the European level relative to the taxonomy we will make a big change. It will be very difficult to finance new nuclear reactors. Things are different with respect to the existing ones, the historical one, which are direly needed by the day, but unfortunately they do not work as they used to do. The capacity factor has went down constantly, and now is with the new issues on some relatively recent nuclear reactors in France. It's still going down at a time where it would be precious to have it for avoiding too much recourse to Russian gas.
Or coal.
The time is running very fast. We are nearly at the end. There is another question from Marius Law. The use of renewable energies is not a guarantee of energy independence either compared to fossil fuels because of the issues of intermittency and rare materials. What do you think about that?
If I may pick this up, first, with renewables, you still reduce very much the dependency on fossil fuels because you only need some fossil gas as backup during short periods of time. Even if you need a significant amount of plants, but you reduce the terawatt hour much more than you reduce the gigawatt. You have a need for some strong power, but for short periods of time. So you still reduce the dependency. Studies show that in Germany, it will be 36 terawatt hour per year versus 86 in 2019. So you still, for gas. Studies show that in France, it will remain about where it is now, between 25 to 35 terawatt hour a year, according to RTE, which is 35, which is what we had in 2019. So no big change, no worsening of that, and even in the best case, for now, which is almost full decarbonized power sector production in France due to the nuclear that is slowly aging and disappearing. The other point, metals is true for the vehicles much more than for the production of from the renewables, except the offshore wind farm that requires some rare earths. The others, they don't require very rare metals. They require some copper. Copper will be a problem in general for the grids extensions. But nothing very, very rare. And then when things are built, you're certainly not in the same problem of energy security than you are with fossil fuels, which need constant delivery. That for the metals, when you have the metals and you have built your power plants, your wind turbines and your solar PV farms, you're done. And for the next 30 years, you're done. So it cannot be compared with the energy unsecurity you have with fossil fuels, which is immediate. I mean, you have a problem. Well, we have 90 days of oil imports as an obligation, of stockholding obligation in the IEA, it's at 90 days. With renewables, when it's done, you have 30 years. Big difference.
If I may just add to the first point, we are with renewables, which are domestic, we're very strongly decreasing the exposure to external security supply issues, to interruption of supply for whatever reason they may occur, or even prices, volatility of prices, of course. The person who asked the question is correct in the sense that we may increase the domestic insecurity, not reliability of electricity supply compared to the old system. But, and this is where I would like to jump in. It's not only the backup where we can back up with gas, which is part of the flexibility mechanisms which we have to incorporate a very large amount of renewables in the mix. We also have demand response, the capacity of demand to react, to storage, and interconnection, of course, and not to forget something which is rather new, sector coupling. With among different sectors, with hydrogen for storage as well, but also with transport, using the batteries of the cars and so on. So there are plenty of tools which we have available to reduce. Zero risk doesn't exist anywhere, but to reduce the risk of running into big problems, going to a very high rate of renewable penetration in our systems.
Thank you very much. The time, in fact, is over. It remains a lot of questions, but we should close. I think that it was a very interesting and constructive debate. It has been shown that it is not an easy to determine tomorrow's optimal clean energy system, largely because the costs, limitation, capability developments of competing technologies are very difficult to predict. Energy systems with widely divergent share of green fuels in form of electricity, hydrogen, synthetic hydrocarbons remain conceivable, but they involve larger investments at different stages of the value chain. Current projections show an overall cost advantage for different electrification, but projections will involve critical players may push hard for alternative fuels. Policy will thus play a major role in shaping this balance. So many interesting issues remain to be tackled by Enerdata in the near and longer future. Many thanks to the speakers, to all of you for the participation. Please do not forget that the debate continues next week in the same day, the same hour. All the best. See you soon in other interesting events.
Bye-bye, and thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
It was a pleasure being with you.